I grew up in what most people would call a nice house. My dad, who sold agricultural equipment for a living, had worked his way up from nothing to build his own company. He wasn't just good at it, he was really good at it. The kind of good that meant we never had to worry about money. My mom, well, she was something else entirely. She never worked a day in her life, which was fine by Dad. He wanted her to be happy, to enjoy the life he'd built for us. But Mom's version of being a housewife didn't involve much actual housework. Instead, her days were filled with shopping trips, salon appointments, and what seemed like endless meetups with her friends. Dad loved Mom so much, he let her get away with pretty much anything. The drinking with her friends, the shopping sprees, even forgetting to pick me up from school sometimes, he'd just sigh and make excuses for her. I was 9 when everything started to change. Dad had to go on a business trip, something about a big client in another state. He didn't want to go, I could tell, but he didn't have much choice. Before he left, I heard him talking to Mom in the kitchen. "Sarah, please remember Rita needs to be picked up at 3:15, he said. "Set an alarm if you need to." "James, I'm not an idiot," Mom snapped back. "I can handle taking care of my own daughter for a few days." Turns out, she couldn't. The day started normal enough. Dad had already been gone 2 days, and everything had been fine. But that afternoon, when I walked out of school, Mom wasn't there. I waited 15 minutes, then started walking home. It wasn't far, and I'd done it before when Mom was running late. But when I got to our house, I realized this time was different. The house was locked up tight, and I didn't have a key. Mrs. Peterson, our neighbor, was out watering her flowers when she saw me standing there. "Oh, Rita honey," she called out, looking uncomfortable. "Your mom left a few hours ago with Caroline and that whole group. They were talking about some wine tasting event." My stomach dropped. I pulled out the emergency phone Dad had given me and tried calling Mom. No answer. I tried again, and again. Nothing. The hours ticked by slowly as I sat on our front porch. Mrs. Peterson brought me a jacket when it started getting cold, but Mom still didn't show up. Finally, as it was getting dark, I called Dad. "Daddy?" My voice was shaking. "I'm locked out. Mom's not home and she won't answer her phone. I'm sitting on our porch. Mrs. Peterson's been checking on me." "Okay, listen carefully. I'm coming home right now. Ask Mrs. Peterson if you can stay with her tonight. I'll be there as fast as I can drive." Mrs. Peterson made up her guest room for me that night. I could barely sleep, listening for the sound of Dad's car. He pulled into the driveway around 2 a.m., having driven straight through from his business meeting 3 states away. His face was tired but determined as he thanked Mrs. Peterson and took me home. We waited in the living room. Dad tried to get me to go to bed, but I refused. I wanted to see Mom's face when she walked in. It wasn't until 8 a.m., 8 o'clock in the morning, that we heard the familiar sound of Mom's Mercedes pulling into the driveway. She stumbled through the front door, her designer dress wrinkled, her makeup smeared. She smelled like a wine cellar. When she saw Dad sitting in his armchair, her bleary eyes went wide. "James, what are you doing home?" "What am I doing home?" Dad's voice was quiet, but I'd never heard him so angry. "Our 9-year-old daughter spent hours locked out of her house yesterday. She had to stay with neighbors because her mother was too busy partying to remember she exists." Mom tried to laugh it off. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. Rita's fine, aren't you, sweetheart?" She reached for me, but I backed away. "Fine?" Dad stood up so fast, his chair scraped against the floor. "She called me crying, Sarah. She couldn't reach you for hours. What if something had happened to her?" "I just lost track of time," Mom whined, tears starting to form in her eyes. "The girls and I were having such a nice time." "The girls?" Dad's voice boomed through the house. "Your daughter should come before the girls and their wine tastings. What kind of mother are you?" Mom collapsed onto the couch, sobbing now. I'm so sorry." It won't happen again, I promise. It took a week of Mom's tears and promises before Dad finally softened. But something had changed permanently. I saw it in the way Mom looked at me when Dad wasn't around, cold, distant, like I was the one who had done something wrong. When Dad was home, she'd put on a show of maternal affection, hugging me and asking about my day. But the moment he turned his back, her smile would vanish. 7 years passed like that, with Mom treating me like an unwanted houseguest whenever Dad wasn't looking. I learned to stay in my room, to make myself scarce, to avoid being alone with her. I was 16 when our fragile family balance completely fell apart. It started with Dad getting sick. At first, it was just fatigue and some weight loss, nothing too alarming. But when he started getting stomach pains that wouldn't go away, we knew something was wrong. The doctors ran test after test, unable to figure out what was happening. Finally, after what felt like endless hospital visits, we got the diagnosis, a rare form of cancer. Mom acted concerned when people were watching, but I heard her true feelings when she thought no one was listening. It's just so exhausting, she'd whisper to her friends on the phone, pacing in the kitchen. Do you know how many special meals I have to cook now? And he's always home, I can barely leave the house without him asking where I'm going. It's like being in prison. I'd stand in the hallway, my blood boiling, listening to her complain about taking care of her dying husband. But I never told Dad. He had enough to worry about without knowing his wife saw him as a burden. For a year, Dad tried to keep everything normal. He'd sit in his home office, making business calls between treatments, pretending the cancer wasn't slowly eating away at him. I'd bring him tea and sit with him, watching him put on a brave face for his employees and clients. Then one day, he called Mom and me into his office. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw his face. I'm selling the business, he said without preamble, his hands folded on his desk. The doctors, they've told me I don't have much time left. His voice cracked slightly. Maybe a few months. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. No, Daddy, no. The tears came instantly, and I couldn't stop them. Rita, sweetheart, Dad reached for my hand. I need to do this. Neither of you could run the company after I'm gone, you're too young, and your mother, well, it's not her field. I won't let everything I built crash and burn. At least this way, I can make sure you're both taken care of. Mom made a show of crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but I caught her checking her phone while Dad wasn't looking. Her tears were as fake as her designer handbags. The weeks that followed were brutal. Dad got weaker by the day. I started rushing home from school, dropping my backpack at the door and heading straight to his room. Sometimes I'd do my homework sitting next to his bed, other times I'd just hold his hand while he slept. The nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, was there during the day, making sure Dad took his medications and helping him eat. But Mom? She was barely around. When she did show up, she'd wrinkle her nose and complain about the hospital smell in the house. I just can't handle being here all the time, she told me one day, applying lipstick in the hallway mirror. The smell of sickness, it's everywhere. I need to get out, to breathe. What she meant was she needed to party. To shop. To pretend her husband wasn't dying upstairs. When Dad's condition got so bad they had to move him to the hospital, Mom stopped coming home at night completely. She'd breeze in at dawn, looking suspiciously happy for someone whose husband was dying in a hospital bed. One morning, I couldn't take it anymore. Where were you all night? I demanded as she walked in, wearing the same clothes as yesterday. That's none of your business, young lady, she snapped, but I could smell the alcohol on her breath. Dad is dying in the hospital, and you're out partying? How can you? She cut me off, grabbing my arm hard enough to hurt. Her face was inches from mine, her perfect makeup couldn't hide the fury in her eyes. Listen to me very carefully, she hissed. You're going to keep your mouth shut and show me some respect. Otherwise, I promise you, I will make your life a living hell. Don't test me, Rita. You won't like what happens if you do. Dad died on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week before my 18th birthday. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, while Mom was getting coffee somewhere in the hospital. At the funeral, she put on quite a show. She wore a designer black dress and dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting condolences with a trembling voice. "He was my everything," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "I don't know how I'll go on without him." But the moment the last mourner left the cemetery, it was like someone had flipped a switch. The tears dried up instantly, and she was checking her phone, smiling at text messages while we rode home in the funeral car. The next week was surreal. I walked through school like a zombie, barely able to focus on classes. My friends tried to comfort me, but how do you explain to people your age what it feels like to lose your father while watching your mother act like she'd just been released from prison? When my birthday came around, I didn't expect much, but I at least thought she'd acknowledge it. She didn't. I didn't even see her that day. She was gone before I woke up and hadn't come home by dinner. My friends took me to a small cafe downtown, bought me a cake, and tried to make me smile. It worked, a little. I ended up staying at my best friend Jenny's house that night, not wanting to go home to an empty house on my birthday. The next morning, I walked into our kitchen to find Mom there with a man I'd never seen before. He looked maybe 35, a good 15 years younger than her, and had his arm wrapped around her waist like he owned the place. "Oh good, you're here," Mom said, not even bothering to hide her annoyed tone. "Rita, this is Brad, my fiancé." I stood there, coffee mug frozen halfway to my mouth. "You're what?" "My fiancé," she repeated slowly, like I was stupid. "And now that you're here, we need to talk about arrangements." "Arrangements?" The word felt wrong in my mouth. "Yes. You need to leave." She smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. "Your father is gone now, and all his money is mine? I can finally live the way I want, with who I want." She squeezed Brad's arm. "And that doesn't include having a teenager around." "You're kicking me out?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This is my house too." "No, it's not." Mom marched upstairs and came back dragging my suitcase. She started throwing my clothes into it, not even bothering to fold them. "You're 18 now. I'm not legally required to support you anymore. I want you gone within the hour." "Mom, please." "Don't mom me," she snapped, shoving more of my belongings into the suitcase. "I'd done my duty. I raised you. Now it's time for me to be happy." Standing on the sidewalk with my hastily packed suitcase, I felt completely lost. I had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Dad was an only child, and Mom's family had cut ties with her years ago for reasons she never explained. With shaking hands, I called Jenny. "Of course you can stay with me," she said immediately when I explained what happened, her voice full of concern and anger on my behalf. "My mom's been worried about you anyway. She actually mentioned last night that she was afraid something like this might happen. Come over right now." Jenny and her mom lived in a modest 3-bedroom apartment across town. They set me up on their pull-out couch in the living room, bringing out their nicest sheets and even buying me new pillows. It wasn't much, but compared to being homeless, it felt like a luxury hotel. Jenny's mom hugged me tight and whispered, "Stay as long as you need, sweetheart." The next week passed in a blur as I threw myself into final exams, trying desperately to keep my grades up even though my world was falling apart. I studied late into the night, partly because I needed to pass, but mostly because it kept me from thinking about my situation. I had no idea what I'd do after graduation. College seemed impossible now that I had no home and no money. Every time I thought about the future, panic would start to set in. Then Mrs. Peterson, our old neighbor, called. "Rita, honey," she said, her voice gentle but strained. "I thought you should know. Your mother is planning an engagement party at the house next weekend. She's been going all out, ordering catering, hiring decorators, the works." My stomach churned violently. An engagement party? Dad's been dead less than a month. His grave hasn't even settled yet. I know, dear. I'm so sorry. I just thought you should know, since. She trailed off awkwardly. We both knew I hadn't been invited. Hadn't even been told. It's absolutely shameful, she added, anger creeping into her usually sweet voice. I spent the next few days alternating between rage and despair. How could Mom move on so quickly? How could she pretend Dad never existed? While I was still crying myself to sleep most nights, still wearing Dad's old sweater because it smelled like him, she was planning a party to celebrate her engagement to a man young enough to be her son. 3 days after Mrs. Peterson's call, my phone rang again. This time, it was a man identifying himself as Herbert Maxwell, a notary public. His voice was formal but kind, reminding me a little of Dad's business voice. Miss Mitchell, he said, I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. It's regarding your father's will. I've been trying to handle some matters remotely, but this requires your presence. When I arrived at his office downtown, Mr. Maxwell, a kind-looking older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a grandfatherly demeanor, got straight to the point. His office smelled like old books and coffee, and somehow that was comforting. Your father made some very specific arrangements before his death, he said, pulling out a thick folder and adjusting his glasses. The house, all of its contents, and the entire proceeds from the sale of his business, everything has been left to you, Miss Mitchell. Additionally, your father set up a trust fund specifically for your college education. He was very thorough in his planning. Mr. Maxwell reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope. Your father also left this for you, he said, sliding it across the desk. He was very specific that you should read it in private. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Dad's familiar handwriting made my eyes well up immediately. My dearest Rita. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm so sorry I had to leave you, sweetheart. There's so much I wanted to see, your graduation, your college years, your wedding someday. But life doesn't always give us what we want. What I can give you, though, is protection. I need to tell you something difficult. I've known for some time about your mother's affair. I've known about her lover, about her plans for my money after I'm gone. I heard her on the phone countless times, planning her future, a future that didn't include you. I want you to understand that this isn't revenge. This is me protecting my daughter, the only person who sat with me through my illness, who held my hand without complaint, who loved me unconditionally. Your mother will receive the car and the jewelry I bought her over the years, they're hers. But everything else, the house, the money for my business, everything, it's yours. You can help your mother if you choose to. That decision is entirely yours to make. But I wanted to make sure she couldn't hurt you anymore, couldn't throw you out onto the street or deny you an education. Love always, Dad. I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. Mr. Maxwell politely pretended to be very interested in organizing his papers. When I could speak again, a question occurred to me. Mr. Maxwell, why isn't my mother here for this? He cleared his throat uncomfortably. I tried to reach her multiple times. When I couldn't get through on the phone, I sent a formal letter about the reading of the will. She never responded. Of course she hadn't. She was too busy planning her engagement party, too caught up in her new life to care about anything related to her old one, including Dad's will. I left Mr. Maxwell's office in a daze, the folder of documents tucked under my arm, Dad's letter safe in my purse. When I got back to Jenny's apartment, I told them everything. Jenny hugged me so hard I could barely breathe, and her mom immediately grabbed her phone. This calls for celebration, she declared, pulling up a delivery app. I'm ordering from that fancy Italian place you girls love. Tonight, we celebrate justice being served. The day of Mom's engagement party arrived exactly 1 month after Dad's funeral. I put on my best black dress, the one Dad had bought me for my last birthday, and did my makeup carefully. If I was going to crash a party, I was going to look good doing it. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree, with cars parked all along our street. Music and laughter spilled out onto the lawn. The front door wasn't even locked, Mom never was good about security. I walked right in. The living room was packed with people, most of them Mom's wine-drinking friends, all dressed up and holding champagne glasses. Brad's friends were easy to spot, younger, trying too hard to look wealthy. The decorations were tasteless and excessive, like everything Mom did. She'd even taken down Dad's photos from the walls. Mom spotted me first. The color drained from her face before being replaced by rage. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, rushing over to me. "Get out, now." She turned to her guests with a fake laugh. "Oh, everyone, this is my daughter. Poor thing, can't accept that she needs to stand on her own 2 feet now. She's here to beg to come home, but I have to be firm. Tough love, you know?" Her friends tittered with laughter. Brad's friends joined in. They all looked at me with that particular mix of pity and contempt that wealthy people reserve for those they consider beneath them. I smiled. Not a nice smile, the kind of smile a shark might give if sharks could smile. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I'm here to collect what belongs to me." Mom laughed mockingly. "Nothing here belongs to you anymore, dear. This is my house now." "No, Mom, it's not." I pulled the wool from my purse and held it up. "This house belongs to me. So does everything in it. Dad left it all to me, the house, the business proceeds, everything. You get to keep your car and jewelry. That's it." The room went dead silent. Mom's face turned an interesting shade of purple. "You're lying," she sputtered. "Would you like to read it?" I offered sweetly. "Or should I call Mr. Maxwell, the notary, to confirm? Better yet, should I call the police to remove all these people who are currently trespassing in my house?" The guests started moving immediately, gathering their coats and bags, muttering awkward excuses. Nobody wanted to be part of this scene. Within minutes, the room had cleared except for Mom and Brad. "Rita, sweetie," Mom's voice turned sugary. "We can work this out. We're family. Your father wouldn't want us fighting like this." I just shook my head and pointed to the door. "You're right about one thing, Mom. Dad wouldn't want us fighting. That's why he made sure we wouldn't have to. The door's that way." Mom didn't go quietly. She never did anything quietly. "You ungrateful little bitch," she screamed, her perfect makeup running with angry tears. "After everything I've done for you." Brad stood awkwardly beside her, his eyes darting between Mom and me, then to the door, like he was calculating his escape route. I noticed he'd stopped touching her, had actually taken a few steps away from her meltdown. "Everything you've done for me?" I laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Like abandoning me when I was 9? Like complaining about taking care of Dad when he was dying? Like throwing me out the day after my 18th birthday?" By this point, neighbors had started gathering on our front lawn, drawn by Mom's screaming. Mrs. Peterson was there, along with the Johnsons from across the street and the Mendozes from next door. They weren't even trying to hide that they were watching. "This isn't over." Mom grabbed her designer purse from the sofa. "I'll get a lawyer. I'll contest the will." "Good luck with that," I said calmly. "Dad made everything legally bulletproof. But hey, feel free to waste whatever money you have left on lawyers." That's when I saw it, the moment Brad's expression changed. He looked at Mom like he was seeing her for the first time, and he didn't like what he saw. A broke, aging woman with no house, no inheritance, and no prospect of getting either. "Sarah," he said, backing toward the door. "Maybe we should take some time, to process all this." Mom's face crumpled as she realized what was happening. "Brad, baby, don't do this. We can figure something out." But Brad was already gone, practically running to his car. Mom chased after him, still screaming, but he drove away without looking back. The neighbors burst into applause. "It's about time," Mrs. Peterson called out, coming up to hug me. "Your father would be so proud of you, honey." One by one, the neighbors came up to express their support. Mrs. Mendoza brought over a casserole. You can't live on takeout forever, Majida, and Mr. Johnson offered to help me change the locks, just in case. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces about Mom through the neighborhood grapevine. Brad had broken off the engagement immediately. Apparently, a woman with no money and no house wasn't what he'd signed up for. Mom had tried staying with various friends, but they all suddenly became too busy to host her. Her expensive friends disappeared as quickly as Dad's money had. The last I heard, she'd moved to Florida to live with a second cousin, the only relative willing to take her in. She tried calling me a few times, leaving voicemails full of tears and apologies and requests for money. I blocked her number. I graduated high school with honors, just like Dad always knew I would. Jenny's mom and Mrs. Peterson sat in the family section, cheering louder than anyone when I walked across the stage. The college fund Dad set up meant I could attend any university I wanted, so I chose Dad's alma mater, a great business school on the West Coast. I'm majoring in business administration with a minor in agricultural studies. Maybe someday I'll start my own company, like Dad did. But for now, I'm just focusing on building the life I want, free from Mom's toxic influence and secure in the knowledge that Dad's last act was to make sure I'd be okay.